My wife insisted I stop spending time with my elderly grandmother who raised me after my parents passed away, so I chose divorce. Hey Reddit! Before we dive in, just a quick note. We're working super hard to bring you the best stories out there, so hit that subscribe button and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers soon. Let's start the story. I'm 31 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my grandmother has been the cornerstone of my life. When I was just 6, my parents were taken from me in a terrible highway accident. The grief was overwhelming for a child, but my grandmother stepped in without hesitation. She postponed her retirement plans, rearranged her entire life, and created a loving home for a devastated little boy. She became my rock, my mentor, and the person who showed me what unconditional love truly means. Growing up in Maplewood, a quiet suburb of Riverdale, my grandmother made countless sacrifices to ensure I had everything I needed. She attended every school event, learned to cook my favorite meals, and even joined the PTA when no one else would volunteer. We formed a bond that transcended the typical grandparent-grandchild relationship. She wasn't just my grandmother, she was my hero. As years passed, I met and married my wife. In the beginning, she seemed to understand the special connection I shared with my grandmother. She knew about my weekly visits across town to help with groceries, household repairs, and to simply share meals together. During our early relationship, she would occasionally join me, bringing small gifts or preparing special dishes my grandmother enjoyed. I treasured those moments, grateful to see the two most important women in my life connecting. But as our marriage progressed, subtle changes emerged. My wife began complaining about the drive, about wasting weekends at the old lady's place, instead of doing something more exciting. I tried compromising by shortening our visits or suggesting I go alone every other weekend so she could have personal time, but I refused to abandon my grandmother entirely. She was aging, living alone in our old family home in East Maplewood, and deserved regular company. I couldn't bear the thought of her sitting alone, waiting for visits that never came. The friction intensified after we relocated to a more upscale neighborhood in North Riverdale, adding an extra 30 minutes to the drive. My wife's comments became more pointed. "She survived this long. She doesn't need a babysitter every weekend." I gently reminded her that my grandmother had sacrificed her own comfort and plans to raise me. These visits were the least I could do to repay that love. Tensions escalated. My wife would roll her eyes whenever I mentioned visiting on Saturday mornings, claiming I was wasting precious time that should be invested in our marriage. Eventually, the arguments intensified. She accused me of prioritizing my grandmother over our relationship. "You're gone half the weekend," she'd complain, though in reality I spent perhaps 3 hours there before returning home. She eventually refused to accompany me at all, saying it was boring and she had better things to do. I didn't mind going alone. In fact, it was probably better than forcing her to come unwillingly, but this only fueled more conflicts. She insisted I was neglecting her needs, which bewildered me. How could a weekly visit constitute neglect? The breaking point occurred on a crisp autumn Sunday. I returned home later than usual after helping my grandmother repair a leaking faucet and cleaning her gutters before winter. My wife stood in our living room, arms crossed, face rigid with anger. She didn't ask about my day or my grandmother's well-being. Instead, she issued a cold demand. "This has to stop." When I asked what she meant, her response chilled me. "I want you to cut back drastically on these visits or stop altogether. She's lived her life. It's time you focus on this marriage instead." My heart raced as I defended my position. "She's my grandmother. She raised me after my parents died. I'm not abandoning her just because you find it inconvenient," she pressed on, calling it excessive loyalty and suggesting I should wean myself away. The entitlement in her tone stunned me. This wasn't merely about annoyance at the time I spent away. She was treating my grandmother as a disposable figure in my life, a nuisance to be discarded. That confrontation ignited weeks of heated arguments. My wife demanded I set a strict schedule, visiting my grandmother perhaps once monthly at most. I refused to agree to any such limitation. She claimed I was ignoring her wishes, that a real husband wouldn't place an elderly grandparent over their spouse's comfort. Her words cut deeply. I'd always believed marriage meant supporting each other's families, especially those who shaped us into who we are. Our home transformed into a battlefield. Each time I grabbed my keys to visit my grandmother, my wife would glare, sometimes launching into another tirade. "Didn't you just go last weekend?" If I explained that my grandmother needed groceries or help managing her medications, she'd scoff about how any neighbor could do that. The disrespect toward the woman who'd raised me was unbearable. The situation deteriorated further when I discovered my wife had been telling our friends that my grandmother was manipulative and demanding of my time. Furious, I confronted her about spreading these falsehoods. She merely shrugged, saying she needed to vent because no one understood how she was stuck with a husband who prioritizes an old lady over building a future. Despite the tension, I continued visiting my grandmother, though I shortened the visit slightly, hoping to ease the conflicts at home. But nothing was ever enough for my wife. She wanted me to stop altogether. When my grandmother fell ill with pneumonia, I stayed at her home overnight to care for her. My wife's messages were relentless and unsympathetic. "When are you coming back? This is ridiculous." When I explained the seriousness of the situation, her response was callous. "Let her hire a nurse. You have a wife at home." That statement confirmed the depth of her resentment. After my grandmother recovered, I returned home exhausted, only to face another barrage of complaints. Finally, my wife delivered an ultimatum. "Either stop wasting time with that old woman, or this marriage is over." Hearing her refer to my grandmother as "that old woman" was the final straw. I realized I couldn't continue living in a marriage built on such cruel ultimatums. My grandmother had never asked me to choose, never disliked my wife, never interfered in our relationship. Yet my wife was demanding I abandon the person who had stepped up when tragedy struck. "If that's your condition for staying married," I replied coldly, "then we're done." She seemed shocked, perhaps believing I would capitulate as I had compromised before. But something had broken inside me. The combination of seeing my grandmother's tearful face worried about being a burden, plus my wife's callousness, formed an unshakable resolve. As I proceeded with divorce paperwork, my wife cycled through tactics: tears, rage, manipulation, claiming I'd never find another partner who tolerated my devotion to my grandmother. That statement only underscored her fundamental misunderstanding of family loyalty and compassion. Throughout the divorce process, my grandmother, ever thoughtful, asked if my wife was all right. I reassured her none of this was her fault. The divorce proceeded swiftly given our relatively short marriage and limited shared assets. Now, free from my ex-wife's demands, I've established a new routine. After work, I visit my grandmother several times weekly, helping with errands, cooking together, or simply listening to stories about my parents. These moments feel infinitely more precious now that I'm not battling a spouse who resented them. Sometimes my grandmother asks if I'll marry again. I smile, telling her I'm in no hurry. Someone who truly loves me will respect my devotion to her. She squeezes my hand at that, her eyes crinkling with understanding. Looking back, I realize my ex-wife's sense of entitlement was doomed from the start. When she forced me to choose between my family and her, the decision was clear. While the separation was painful, I feel nothing but relief that I escaped a relationship that demanded I sever the most important bond in my life. No spouse, no matter how insistent, will ever make me abandon my family again.